Welcome to A-Push. Today we're going to try to wrap up the story of Andrew Jackson by finishing out some of the events leading up to and then concluding his second term. So, without further ado, here are your basic objectives. Please pause and take note of them. And let's try to finish the rest of the Andrew Jackson stories. Oh man, so many. So, Andrew Jackson was the first president to be physically assaulted while in office. One, when he was at a diplomatic event of some sort, a disgruntled American came up and punched Jackson in the face. After he was wrestled to the ground and then pulled away, Jackson famously retorted, "Had I been standing when he struck me, he never would have left here alive." So this is how Jackson deals with crises and issues, which leads us to the Nullification Crisis of 1832. This was one of the key issues of Jackson's presidency because it led to a massive political reorganization, and it was over protective tariffs and South Carolina. As you hopefully remember, the protective tariffs were put in place in order to protect American industry as part of the American system in order to spur American manufacturing. Southern states were unhappy with this because they saw this as simply raising prices for them, whereas they don't get the benefits because, one, they don't have many factories in the South, and two, the money from these tariffs was being used in order to fund infrastructure projects which were unnecessary in the South. So for the South, they see this as purely negative for them. And so what ended up happening is South Carolina tried to, for the first time ever, nullify a federal law. They believed that they had this right because, of course, the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions laid out the whole doctrine of nullification. And so South Carolina decided that they were no longer going to collect or enforce federal tariffs. This led to a massive showdown between Jackson and his, of course, vice president, John C. Calhoun. And there's a famous story about a dinner party between them that demonstrates the awkwardness and the positions that both of them were in, where Jackson was giving a toast, arguing, "Our federal union, it must be preserved," to John C. Calhoun, because Calhoun had been going around saying, well, if you're going to force South Carolina to collect this tariff, we may just secede from the union. And so Calhoun countered with a toast of his own saying, "The union, next to our liberty, most dear." And then my favorite part of this story is apparently after the dinner, Jackson then pulled John C. Calhoun aside and said, "John C. Calhoun, if you secede from my nation, I will secede your head from your body." And Calhoun, of course, left somewhat shaken. And this broke the political alliance between Jackson and Calhoun and left them political enemies from there on out. Jackson, in response to South Carolina's attempt to nullify the tariff, passed what was called the Force Act, which basically gave Jackson the power to arm a bunch of tax collectors and send them south to South Carolina to reduce the state if necessary. It ended up not being necessary because the prospect of the hero of New Orleans leading a group of armed tax collectors to destroy South Carolina freaked out the South Carolinians for what I hope are obvious reasons. And South Carolina ended up backing down, agreeing to indeed enforce federal tariffs. So, nullification crisis over. Jackson then passes a compromise tariff to keep everyone happy. But again, it emphasizes sort of the way that Jackson views himself, the presidency, and the federal government. We also have the Bank War, which is another major crisis leading up to Jackson's re-election. The Bank War was Jackson's fight against the Second National Bank. Jackson, as a Southern landowner, was deeply in debt and was distrustful of banks in general and of the Second National Bank in particular. Jackson was of the belief that this bank was funneling money to his political opponents, which admittedly it may have been. And so John C. Calhoun and the head of the bank, Nicholas Biddle, set a trap for Andrew Jackson, by which they passed a bank recharter bill several years early. The bank wouldn't have had to be rechartered until 36, but they passed one in 32, figuring that Jackson would have to do one of two things. Either he would have to let the bank recharter go through, giving the bank another 20-year lifespan, or Jackson could veto the bank, which they believed was overwhelmingly popular. Jackson, here he is slaying the many-headed monster, aka the bank, took the bait and vetoed the bank bill, and then arguing basically that the bank was trying to take him down, and so he would take the bank down instead. And then to make sure that the bank was destroyed quickly and wasn't able to strike back against him, Jackson withdrew all federal funds from the bank. And so the bank would continue to exist for 4 years, but with no money in the bank, it couldn't give loans or fulfill any of its duties. Jackson's enemies argued that this was a massively unconstitutional power grab, and that vetoing the bank bill was his right, but then taking all the money out of the bank was really problematic. And so this is the beginning of the caricature of Jackson as King Andrew I. I'll point out a couple pretty awesome things here. Obviously, Jackson's dressed like Queen Elizabeth, which is nice. He's carrying a veto in his hand here, and he's also stomping all over the Constitution of the United States, which is what his enemies accused him of doing, is acting unconstitutionally. This also led to the first ever assassination attempt of a sitting president, as a man who had lost his job because the bank had been shut down approached Andrew Jackson, drew a pistol, and attempted to shoot him in the chest. The pistol misfired, so the guy drew a backup pistol and again prepared to shoot him in the chest, and that pistol misfired as well. And so Andrew Jackson then drew his cane and, wielding it like a sword, proceeded to beat the man within an inch of his life. The would-be assassin then had to be saved by Jackson's bodyguard, again helping to build this cult personality around Andrew Jackson. Jackson now had all of this federal money at his disposal and used it to increase his re-election chances and to increase his own power. He did this by giving out these surplus funds to what were called pet banks, which are state-chartered banks that supported Andrew Jackson. And so by funneling this money to his political supporters, he was able to wield great power, both as far as getting the money to people who would use it for things he agreed with, and also, of course, these supporters are now totally dependent on him for these federal funds. And so Jackson took the whole bank war and turned it greatly to his advantage, and stole a key piece of John C. Calhoun's American system, fully destroying it. The problem, of course, is now this is going to create some issues, because these state banks are going to start loaning out tons of money. And so what we started seeing is massive inflation. And of course, this is going to come back around at some point. And so Jackson tried to pass something called the Specie Circular, which made it so you could only buy federal lands with hard money, not with bank-issued notes. The unfortunate side effect of this is, of course, it also led to a massive devaluation of the currency and more inflation, which was already a significant problem. But Jackson didn't have to deal with this, because generally the economic effects of a president's actions happen somewhat downstream. And so it's usually the president's successor that has to clean up the economic messes that are created by some of their more questionable decisions. The election of 1832 was not particularly close, despite all of the anti-Jackson opposition. And this is for a couple different reasons. Jackson significantly increased his own power, but the way in which he increased his own power was a way that most people agreed with. So you could argue that the Trail of Tears and Jackson's actions as far as the Indian Removal Act and the Force Act were unconstitutional, but people in general supported the outcomes, and so does it matter? And the vetoing of the national bank was problematic, at least for people in the North and the West, or some people in the North and the West. But for his supporters in the South, they didn't like the national bank anyway, so of course they supported him. There were a bunch of anti-Jackson forces, but the problem is they were not particularly unified, and they didn't have a specific platform like Jackson had in order to try to figure out all of these issues. So despite the fact that you've got guys like Daniel Webster and Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun all opposing Andrew Jackson, they're all opposing him for a variety of different reasons. And so they're not going to come together on a candidate. And so the end result of this is you're going to have a bunch of different anti-Jackson parties, which all sort of are running on their own agenda and, of course, are going to split the vote, which means that Jackson is going to win relatively easily. The other thing that siphoned off votes for anti-Jackson candidates is we have our first ever major third party. The first third party is called the Anti-Mason Party. And the Anti-Mason Party is against the Freemasons, which, if you believe conspiracy theories and all this stuff, are a secret society of wealthy people pulling the strings from behind, throughout all of world history. But The Masons, so a guy named William Morgan had formerly been a Mason, and he was going to write a book about all the supposed secrets of the Masonic order, which would reveal all of these nefarious doings of the Masons. And then he was murdered. So this kicked off, especially in New York, a wave of anti-Masonic sentiment. And we get the anti-Mason party down here, which got about 20% of the popular vote. And although it did not win any key states, it did siphon off enough votes, especially in northern states who were more worried about the Freemasons, in order to sabotage Henry Clay running on his National Republican ticket and allowing Jackson to sweep a lot of the more populous northern states. You also hopefully notice South Carolina is running their own candidate because they're still mad about that whole Force Act thing. And so their electoral votes are going to go to a different candidate. This is the first time that this has occurred, but it is certainly not going to be the last. So Andrew Jackson is reelected easily, and he has to deal with a series of crises that he more or less ignores for most of his second term. One of the issues that Jackson has to deal with is a rebellion in northern Mexico. All of these states in northern Mexico, and then of course also in the Yucatan, declared independence from the central government in opposition to General Santa Anna's rewriting of the Mexican Constitution, which is a story we'll talk more about later. But what was important for the United States is that the state of Texas was settled, or significant portions of it were settled by Americans who had moved in from the South. And so there was a question as to whether or not the United States should intervene in the whole Texas independence issue, and whether or not Texas maybe should join the United States. But Jackson didn't want to deal with this thorny issue, and so it got kicked down the road for another decade or so. Jackson also finally finished destroying the rest of Henry Clay's legacy, the American system. He vetoed a series of bills that were supposedly pushing, or that were designed to create infrastructure. Most famously, the Maysville Road Bill, which was going to add another sort of cross-state highway. And he lowered protective tariffs and destroyed the national bank. So all these pillars of the American system are now gone, and that's going to have a profound effect on the American economy going forward. And Jackson led to political chaos because of this, or created political chaos because of this. And so what you started getting out of this chaos is Henry Clay specifically started building a much larger anti-Jackson coalition to attempt to take down Andrew Jackson. He joined together with Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, who you of course remember as the second of our triumvirs. And he tried to pull in John C. Calhoun, although Calhoun remained loyal to the Democratic Party. And so, as Jackson leaves office, we leave you with this amazing Jackson quote. "After 8 years as president, I have only 2 regrets: that I have not shot Henry Clay or hanged John C. Calhoun." And so with that, Andrew Jackson is going to exit the scene. Make sure you can answer these questions, and hopefully you have some insight into / opinions about Andrew Jackson, one of our more controversial presidents.